Welcome to another episode of Mike's Money Picks. Today on the podcast, we are continuing our position by position series for the 2024 fantasy football season. This is our running back sell list for the 2024 season. If you missed the running back buy list, then just scroll on back on the audio feed on Spotify app or wherever you're listening. Scroll on down on the channel on YouTube. Check out that video for the running back buy list because this is quite the opposite. This is the running back sell list. You know, a lot of people for fantasy football do like or dislike or love or hate. Well, us here at Mike's Money Picks, we got to make it a little bit money themed, right? So we do buy or sell. So what does it mean for running backs who find their way on the sell list? Well, it means that I have these players ranked lower than consensus at their position. I am not willing to draft them at their current ADP, and I do believe that they have a very high chance of busting. Essentially, I don't like being dichotomous. I do not like saying do not draft certain players because I think there's situations where you might want to draft pretty much any player. Like if they fall to you, if the draft kind of breaks a certain way or whatever, there's situations where guys on this list I still find them draftable. But I am not drafting these guys at ADP. I'm not drafting them where they currently sit. I want these guys to fall to me later in the draft and where they're at, and then and only then would I consider drafting them on my team. There is one special example which we are going to give him plenty of airtime here on this episode. Now, for my full ranks for the running backs that I'm buying, selling, indifferent towards, head on over to the Patreon, patreon.com/Mike's Money Picks. You can get our full rankings for the 2024 fantasy football season. That also includes every single position: quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end. And also includes our best ball tools if you are into best ball drafting as well. Now, when I use these ADPs and these rankings, these are for redraft PPR season-long fantasy leagues, but a lot of the logic and the player takes can be used in best ball as well. All right, so with that being said, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. That way you can be with us for the rest of our 2024 fantasy football previews. But other than that, let's go ahead and dive into the running back sell list for the 2024 season. So the first running back on my sell list is a guy that is probably the most interesting, what's the word I'm looking for? Most divisive player in fantasy football for the 2024 season. And I got to say, I don't really think he necessarily fits the full description of what I consider to be my sell list. But this to me seems like as good a place as ever to have a dialogue about this player. Well, is it a dialogue if it's only one person talking? Well, either way, we're going to talk about this player. And this player is Devon Achane of the Miami Dolphins. So he is currently going at an ADP of 20 as the 10th running back off the board. I have him ranked as my running back 18. So let's go ahead and talk about Achane and what makes him so divisive. So I think he is the quintessential player that is better in best ball than in season-long fantasy. However, there are certain situations where you might want this player on your roster as opposed to some other guys because of the upside that he brings. Here's what I mean by that. So, really at a glance, Achane's stats last year are quite good, right? Just very good stats. But there's a little bit of red flags. So last year, Devon Achane was running back 5 in fantasy points per game. That sounds really good, right? Well, that includes 1 game of 50 fantasy points, 4 more games over 24 fantasy points, and 3 games of under 5 fantasy points. And he missed 7 games due to injury. So if you're doing the math, pretty much every game he had was over 24 or under 5 fantasy points. That's just an absolutely insane game log, right? Now, granted, the week where he had 50 or, the 4 that he had 24, he pretty much won you that week, right? The other 3 games where he was under 5, he pretty much lost you the week if he was in your starting lineup. In the 7 games that he missed due to injury, obviously he was not in your lineup either way. So here is the deal with Devon Achane. Devon Achane has a weekly upside because of his big playability and the offense that he plays in that virtually no other player in the NFL has at his position, because he is not only incredibly fast, but he plays in an offense that generates a lot of explosive plays in the run game. He will also be utilized a little bit in the passing game as well. But the problem is that he does not have, and we talked about this term on the running back buy list episode, Achane does not have projectable, predictable volume. That means that you cannot depend week in and week out on Devon Achane getting a lot of carries, getting a lot of touches. And, he might not need a whole lot of touches to generate a whole lot of fantasy points, but generally speaking, the more touches you have, the more opportunities you have, that is going to lead to more opportunities to score fantasy points. Just last season, he averaged a 43% snap share, meaning he was not even the RB1 in his own backfield. He was much behind Raheem Mostert, who was well over 50%, and he only had 5 games of double-digit carries. So all of the incredible games that he had happened on incredibly low volume. This makes Achane an absolute outlier statistically in virtually every way. Generally speaking, as volume goes up, fantasy points go up. You see it with guys like Rachaad White, who really wasn't all that great in terms of advanced metrics, didn't break off a lot of explosive plays, but still was a top 10 fantasy running back because he was consistently involved in the offense. Well, Achane was not consistently involved in the offense, but all he needed was just a few plays here and there to make a big impact and score a lot of fantasy points. So to me, drafting Achane depends on your goals and depends on the rest of your roster that you are building around him. If you are building a roster that has more safer, high floor players at other positions, I think getting a guy like Achane is a pretty solid strategy. I also think if you're going all in on super high upside players, I think getting Achane is a viable strategy, because if you draft a whole roster of upside players like Achane, you got to feel like, there's going to be some of them that hit in the same week, and that is going to give you enough weekly upside in order to win some games. So really, I think that you have to, when you draft Achane, know what he is, know what he can be, know what he is not, and understand when you build the rest of your roster what you have in Achane. You have a guy that pretty much every time he is active, you are going to be forced to start, because you never know when he is going to go off. You also never know when he is going to give you a dud. He has the upside to win you a week. He has a distinct lack of volume and lack of opportunities that can lose you a week. Now, here's why I think he's much better in best ball, because in best ball, you don't have to make the decision on whether or not to start or sit him. He goes off for a week, you automatically get his points. He's a dud, you're automatically not getting his points. That makes him an ideal best ball target where you don't have to make the start or sit decision. But in season-long fantasy, you are going to have to make the decision that you are going to start him, and you are going to have to make the decision that you are going to live with the result, whether it is a boom, bust, or somewhere in between. But the bottom line is this: as somebody who pretty much their entire player take on the running back position is everything is going to be based off of volume, volume, volume. That is what the last few years of fantasy football have shown us. It just goes counterintuitively to that to draft Devon Achane. I will add also that I think he is much more viable in bigger leagues. If you are playing with more than 10 teams, like 12, 14, 16, and so on, I think it makes him much more viable, because I think that the players who are going to be starting in your lineup as your second running back and as your flex are going to be likely to be duds anyway. So if you're going to have guys in your lineup that are likely to be duds, you might as well have the guy who has the highest ceiling in the sport as your other running back to hold that starting spot. So that is just my entire thoughts about Devon Achane. Like I said, I don't think he fits what I would traditionally call a sell player, because there are scenarios where I would draft him, but I do think that you have to understand the type of player he is and the type of player that you are getting and the way that you need to build your roster around him if you do pull the trigger and draft Devon Achane, which I am willing to do, but only in certain scenarios. Now, on to running back number 2 on my sell list. This is Jahmyr Gibbs of the Detroit Lions. His current ADP is 12. His rank is the 6th running back off the board. I have him ranked just ever so slightly behind that as my 7th running back off the board, and I have him number 14 overall. The difference in my rankings and in the ADPs is that I have a difference between Kyren Williams and Jahmyr Gibbs. That is the only difference. I have Kyren Williams ranked ahead of Jahmyr Gibbs. I also have Jahmyr Gibbs a lot closer to running back 8 Isaiah Pacheco than he is to the 8th running back drafted in terms of ADP. So let's go ahead and break down why I'm not feeling Jahmyr Gibbs this season. So Jahmyr Gibbs was running back 8 in fantasy points per game last season, which is pretty good. He averaged a 57% snap share, which is okay. The problem is that Jahmyr Gibbs still has a ton of competition for carries and for opportunities in his backfield in David Montgomery. He only helped carry David Montgomery in 3 games last season where they were both active. To me, when I continue to base my running back takes off of predictable, projectable volume, out of all the top running backs, Gibbs is the one that does not have predictable, projectable volume, because David Montgomery is going to be a factor. David Montgomery is likely to see more work in the running game week in and week out than Jahmyr Gibbs, and I just really struggle to pull the trigger on a first or early second round pick on a guy that is not even going to be the leading work getter in his own backfield. That is my issue with Jahmyr Gibbs. I would much rather draft Kyren Williams, who is, very clearly going to be the bell cow in Los Angeles as long as he can stay healthy. I have him very closely ranked to Isaiah Pacheco, who is looking to be the 3-down workhorse back in Kansas City. Now, granted, I didn't go all the way in and put Pacheco ahead of Gibbs because I still do think Gibbs, with his explosive big play ability, with his usage in the passing game, does possess a ton of weekly upside. But I think Gibbs is just kind of a slightly less volatile version of what we were talking about in Devon Achane, where the volume is not there because of Montgomery's presence, but his ability as a playmaker does still give him value in fantasy. I just don't think I'm getting to him all the way up where he is at an ADP of 12 overall. So those are my first two running backs. Let's go ahead and take a quick breather and talk about the second two. All right, the third running back on my sell list for the 2024 season is Jaylen Warren of the Pittsburgh Steelers. His current ADP is 86, and that ranks as the 32nd running back taken off the board, which this is actually in free fall. He was inside the top 25 less than a month ago, so he is already falling. I already had him down pretty low. I've actually lowered him even more in my ranks. He is now my running back 35 off the board, and a big reason why is because Jaylen Warren has came down with a hamstring injury. Hamstring injuries tend to be very lingering. They also tend to really have an effect on the running back position because all it takes is one awkward plant, one awkward cut, one awkward tackle, and all of a sudden that hamstring injury is going to be a factor for a long time. It's going to make you less athletic, less nimble, or just prevent you from playing games, which we can't have in fantasy football, right? We can't have the guy not playing games, and he's not going to be scoring fantasy points if he's not playing games. So Jaylen Warren, big concern in that regard. It's unknown whether he's going to miss week 1. I actually think it might be better for him if he takes some time to get fully healed and then comes back, as opposed to trying to rush back and letting this injury linger. Anyway, he kind of fits in with the theme of this episode, where I don't think Jaylen Warren has a great pathway to projectable, predictable volume. Jaylen Warren last year, as much as everybody liked to say that he was a better player than Najee Harris and that he was more explosive than Najee Harris and that he was just a better running back than Najee Harris and in the end, a better fantasy option than Najee Harris, that just was not really the case or how the Steelers played it out. Jaylen Warren averaged a 48% snap share last season. That is well behind his teammate Najee Harris. He only outcarried Najee Harris in a game once last season, and he only had 4 games over 9 fantasy points last season. So Jaylen Warren not only gives you the floor of guys that we previously talked about, like Devon Achane and Jahmyr Gibbs and other running backs that don't have predictable volume, but he didn't show much of a ceiling either, only having 4 games over 9 fantasy points. So the other variable with Jaylen Warren is that he has Arthur Smith coming into his leading the offense in Pittsburgh. Arthur Smith, formerly the head coach of the Atlanta Falcons. Long-term listeners of the podcast know that I am the leader of the Arthur Smith fan club. I am I've been really critical of Arthur Smith because of how he utilized the skill players in the Falcons offense last season. I feel like he incorrectly utilized Bijan Robinson. I feel like he incorrectly utilized Drake London. I feel like he incorrectly utilized Kyle Pitts. So I don't have a whole lot of faith that Arthur Smith is going to correctly utilize these 2 running backs. So if everything that all the analysts tell me on Twitter is true, that Jaylen Warren is the better player and more explosive player and a better fantasy option than Najee Harris, who's to say that Arthur Smith is going to acknowledge that? In his career, Arthur Smith has generally favored bigger, slower, more methodical running backs, which is what Najee Harris is compared to Jaylen Warren. So I just don't really see a pathway for Jaylen Warren being a very useful fantasy player this year. I don't see any way in which he outpaces what he did last year, which was not very good. And you have to add the injury concerns onto that as well. I have Jaylen Warren as my 35th running back off the board. It is very unlikely with where I have him ranked that he is going to end up on teams in this redraft season, just being totally honest. All right, now the last running back on my sell list is going to be Zamir White. So this one's a little bit of a curveball. Zamir White of the Las Vegas Raiders, his current ADP is 66. He ranks as the 21st running back coming off the board. I have him ranked as my RB25. Zamir White is coming into the season off of the heels on a absolutely killer stretch at the end of last season in which Josh Jacobs was hurt for the Las Vegas Raiders. Now Josh Jacobs is no longer a Las Vegas Raider. He is now a Green Bay Packer. Side note, I kind of really like Josh Jacobs this year, but that's for another time. So anyway, Zamir White, last year when Josh Jacobs got hurt, Zamir White ended the season with 4 straight games of 15 fantasy points or more, which is pretty good for a Las Vegas Raiders running back on an offense that did not score a lot of points. He averaged 21 carries to do so, though. So this means that he needed a lot of opportunities, a lot of work in this backfield in order to score 15 fantasy points in 4 straight games. And oh, by the way, according to Pro Football Focus, he did it against 4 teams who were outside the top 20 in DVOA run defense last year. Basically, Pro Football Focus doing their grades, they think that these were some of the worst run defenses in the league that Zamir White had his 4 performances against. So the bottom line is this. Last season, Zamir White needed to be the only running back around. He needed to go up against some of the worst rushing defenses in the league, and he needed to get a lot of carries in order to score a lot of fantasy points. So while Zamir White has the predictable volume like we've been talking about, he needs every bit of that in order to score a lot of fantasy points. We like to think about like guys having a pathway to, scoring fantasy points, right? Well, Zamir White's pathway is like the game in Squid Game where you're stepping on glass and you don't know whether you're going to fall through it or not, because quite frankly, he needs a lot to go right. And oh, by the way, he only played 8 snaps on 3rd down in all of last season. Credit to Establish the Run for that stat that I found on Twitter. But basically, this guy had 0 usage in the passing game. And they drafted Dylan Lobby, who apparently, when you look at the preseason usage, is also taking a big-time role in the passing game for this Las Vegas Raiders offense. And they also signed Alexander Madison from the Minnesota Vikings last season. Madison did not have a good year for the Vikings, but who's to say that he's not going to have a good year for the Raiders? So the bottom line is this. Zamir White does have predictable volume, like we talked about with this running back episodes. But the problem is that he needs every bit of that volume. He needs every bit of the bad matchups. He needs every bit of the work in order to be successful in fantasy. And I just do not like the concept of having to rely on that for 17 weeks. So that is why Zamir White, while he is the 21st running back coming off the board right now, he ranks as my 25th running back coming off the board. I have him behind the likes of Ramondre Stevenson, David Montgomery, Najee Harris, and I've even moved Devin Singletary ahead of him. So I'm really just not all in on Zamir White. That is why he comes in as the last running back on the sell list for the 2024 season. All right, so that is going to do it for the running back sell list episode. I got to say, this was a little harder to put together than the buy list. If you want to kind of extend the sell list a little bit, you can kind of go back and watch the buy list episode, and just the teammates of the guys that were on the buy list are going to be guys that would also be on my sell list. So, not to spoil it for you, but there's a certain Bronco that makes his way onto my buy list, and there's a certain Bronco that probably after watching that episode you thought was going to be on this sell list. So that's why I kind of decided not to double dip and put both of them here on the buy and the sell list. So if you want to see more about my thoughts on running backs, make sure you go check out the buy list episode. But if this episode helped you guys in any way, please, if you're watching on YouTube, hit the like button. If you are listening on audio, please rate and review wherever you are listening. I cannot express enough how much it helps me out when you guys like the video or rate and review the audio. It helps the podcast and the videos get noticed, helps, get more attraction in searches, just helps grow the community and get more views to the channel and to the audio feed here. And I really do appreciate it when you guys do that. And while you're at it, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. That way you can be with us for the rest of the NFL season, where we will have our buy and sell episodes weekly. So whether you're playing season-long fantasy or DFS, you will know who I like and don't like every single week. And we also have weekly golf and college football content as well. So if you subscribe, you can, kind of discover that and be around for that as well. Now, also, if you are looking to sign up for any new DFS sportsbook player prop site, something like Underdog or any new sportsbooks, I know it's the start of a new NFL season, but if you're looking to sign up anywhere, head on over to signupexpert.com/Mike'sPicks. You will get the best promo codes for any DFS sportsbook player prop site, and it will even location sync to your area to only show you what is allowed in your state. So me in North Carolina, we just got access to sports books in March, so I use this site to sign up for every sports book that like as it opened here in March, and I got the best promo codes that were available. And also by using my link, it shows me a lot of support as well. Also, we talked about a lot of rankings for running backs here on this show. If you want all of the rankings for all of the positions, as well as all of our best ball tools, head on over to the patreon.com/Mike'sMoneyPicks. But all right, y'all, that is going to do it here for this episode. That is going to do it for the running back sell list. If you missed it, go check out the running back buy list. Subscribe to the channel. That way you can be with us for the wide receiver and tight end content that is coming your way for the rest of this week. But hopefully this episode was able to help you guys out a little bit, give you guys a little bit of information on some guys that you don't want to end up with on your roster, or in the case of Devon Achane, how to build your roster in a way that suits what he provides. But hopefully this episode is going to help you guys win your fantasy leagues here this year. So best of luck to you guys. Thank you guys for watching and listening to this point, and I will see you next time.